It's 12 o'clock noon in Los Angeles, and you know what that means, don't you? It's time for another exciting episode of Taxi TV Live. Yeah, baby. Woohoo! And live we are, and our special guest this week is Mr. Aaron Slater from Songwriting Magazine UK.
Hello. Good morning, good evening, good day, wherever you are.
Hi, Aaron. How are you? Good to see you. Thanks for joining me. Let me get the chat room open on my end. You won't see it on your end. There they are, everybody in the chat room. Make sure that we're actually getting signal out there. And we are live. Excellent connection. Yay. Okay, we are good to go. So I'm excited to have Aaron join us. He's the founder of songwritingmagazine.co.uk, in case you want to go check it out, which you should. I stumbled on it, I don't know, a few months ago, and was very, very impressed with the site and reached out, and we're becoming friends and hopefully collaborators on some stuff. And I said, hey, why don't you do a Taxi TV with me? At least our time zones are close. So here we are. And so kind of the general theme of today's show is why some songwriters are successful and others may not be. And we'll get into that kind of stuff later. But I want to start out by letting you know that Aaron was actually a signed singer-songwriter himself in the past. So it gives him, he's been down the road. You've got credibility, my friend. So tell us about that.
Wow. Well, I suppose my sort of songwriting career goes back way before I was actually signed. Going back into sort of the 90s. Actually, we could go all the way back to the 70s. I'm not going to give you my life story. I was born in 1978, but my dad was actually a pretty successful performer in a band called Stackridge in the 70s. Look it up on Google or whatever, and
Stackridge.
Stackridge, yeah, they
Okay.
were they were pretty successful, but their career kind of waned, and my dad sort of left that career behind him, and when I arrived, when I was born, he wasn't really a musician at that point. And then when I grew up and I was about sort of 10, 12, around that sort of time as a teenager, I was starting to get into music, and I was enjoying making music. I picked up an acoustic guitar, and I wanted to sort of, I didn't want to do covers. I wanted to write songs. That was the first inclination. I didn't want to learn Stairway to Heaven. I wanted to write. I wanted to know how Kurt Cobain wrote Smells Like Teen Spirit. I thought that seems insane, to just pick up a guitar and strum some chords and create a song completely from scratch that never existed before. And I was obsessed with a magazine called Q, which isn't going anymore, Q magazine. And I saw these sort of posters that they had, a sort of collection of posters, and there was a poster of Stackridge, and I was like, I recognise that band. And they were performing with Elton John, the Beach Boys, the Eagles at Wembley Stadium. I was just like, I went in the other room and Dad, is this the band you're in? He was like, oh yeah, that was great. I met Elton that night. It was fantastic. It was really
Wow.
like, what? I didn't even realise. Your parents are never cool. I was just like, what? That's really cool. Really? It was like telling me stories, and I wanted to be a songwriter and performer even more at that point. And I asked him to sort of, help me, and he was like, you've got to learn it yourself. You've got to find your own way. And so I was writing songs, playing in bands, and I kept going for quite a few years without any success until I met a songwriter and producer called Will Sims, who's a French producer, and he's doing very well for himself now. He's signed to Universal, and together we wrote a few songs, which then got signed by sort of an imprint, a sub label on Universal, and it was just when Spotify was coming through. And so we wrote an EP, and that got put out, and we carried on writing together. We're still in touch, but I mean, we're going back to what, 2008, 2010, maybe, somewhere around that
I'm
time.
much older than you are, so for me that seems like almost yesterday. But apparently you're young, and that was a long time ago.
It feels like a long time ago. I quickly realized that although I was kind of fascinated with songwriting and absolutely harbored the dream of being a professional songwriter, that I really I thought I could probably be do better serving other songwriters and inspiring other songwriters and trying to get other songwriters, give them success, in a way that I knew I couldn't. So that's why I sort of shifted my focus, and so Songwriting magazine came about.
And how long ago did you start the magazine?
Just so happens it's 10 years, almost to the
Wow.
day.
Congratulations. That's a big deal. Being another business person, it's hard to keep anything running past the first year, let alone 10. So, congratulations.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I started it back then as I was kind of realizing that my songwriting career. I thought, that's fine. I'll park that and I'll maybe come back to it in later life. And that's the beauty of songwriting. I mean, maybe being a pop singer, you really need to be a teenager or in your early 20s. But I've met a lot of successful songwriters who have had success later in life. And so I thought, I'll come back to that. But I had been working. My day job was involved in advertising and marketing and sales, in working for magazine publishers, and I loved the kind of the creative setup of magazines. That the fact that every month you're creating a new publication, and but I was working on holiday magazines. I was working on some dance music magazines. I was like, if ever I was going to launch any sort of magazine, it'd be a songwriting magazine. And back, sort of rewinding back to sort of early 2000s, when I was a budding songwriter trying to learn my craft, I Googled Songwriting magazine. And all I found was American Songwriter, which is still going strong today. I think Performing Songwriter I subscribed to, which unfortunately isn't going. And that was about it, I think. I think there was one in Canada. There certainly wasn't any in the UK whatsoever.
Wow.
There weren't any magazines covering even songwriting in any real kind of stretch. Guitar magazines, yep. Production magazines, yep. But no songwriting magazines. So I bought the domain name songwritingmagazine.co.uk, and thank you, Michael, for the plug early on there. But
My
it's also
pleasure.
songwritingmagazine.com. So wanted to appeal to songwriters stateside, or didn't necessarily have to be British-based songwriters.
Right.
And I kind of just parked that, and I thought, well, when I come round to creating a songwriting magazine, I'll come up with some clever name like, double clef or treble or top line or something like that. But I couldn't think of any decent name, so I thought, let's just have the domain name Songwriting Magazine. That's going to be useful, regardless. And then in 2012, I launched a WordPress blog, a magazine-style blog, if you will, on that domain. And again, I'll just call it Songwriting Magazine. And when I do create an actual magazine, then again, I'll probably come up with a better name. And really couldn't come up with a better name, and just thought,
Yeah.
it says what it is. It's all about the art and craft of writing music and lyrics. It's songwriting. That's what we're all about. We're songwriters. Songwriting is the verb. It's the reason for being for a lot of songwriters. And as our tagline is, it's the heart of great music. I truly believe that. It's the most important facet of music. And if we think about every great song that's ever been written, you can just imagine the songwriter had to go from absolute zero, had to go from a blank canvas
Yep.
and create something from absolutely nothing. And that magic still mystifies me to this day. And so I started the website, and then launched the digital magazine in 2000. I've lost track now. We're on our 27th quarterly issue. So my maths isn't very good.
Roughly
So
7 years.
7 years ish. Yeah, so it is
Yeah.
7 years um, with our 28th issue, which is going to be coming out in a couple of weeks' time, and it's going to be a kind of like a greatest hits. Not all previous content, but some previous content from our early issues, some content that's been on our website and very successful, as well as some new content, but a kind of celebration of the fact it's been 10 years since we started.
Well, congratulations again. That's quite an accomplishment. And the quality of the content that you guys put out is great. And I want to get to that in a minute, but I want to share a story with you. Even though this interview is about you, I've got to share this story because it goes to what you were saying a moment ago, which, nothing happens without a great song. I got my first job in the industry as a 19-year-old at Criteria Studios in Miami, Florida. And the week that I started there, the Eagles were there doing the One of These Nights album. Clapton was there doing the album that had I Shot the Sheriff on it. The Bee Gees were there doing the album that had Jive Talking on it. It was their comeback album. Stephen Stills was under the roof doing a solo album. So there I am vacuuming the floor in the lobby of Studio C. I don't know, maybe 2 days, 3 days, a week into my tenure there. And I see two very important older gentlemen, older meaning they were like over 50 years old, and they're playing pinball in the lobby. And they were Tom Dowd, who's the producer, used to do Aretha, Cream, Ray Charles, I believe. I mean, just hit after hit after hit, a legendary record producer. And the other guy was Arif Mardin, also a legendary producer. And they were playing, like pinball at a blood sport level. And I very rudely interrupted them and said, "Excuse me, can you gentlemen tell me what it is, how you make a hit record?" I was so naive that I didn't know better than to ask these two very important looking guys that question. So happens they were working with Rod Stewart, and you could hear the rhythm track to "Do You Think I'm Sexy" was coming through the back wall. And I said to them, "So what does it take to make a hit record?" And they stopped playing, looked a little ticked off at me, and Tom Dowd says, "Look, on the other side of that wall, we got one of the greatest artists of all time. We've got the greatest bass player, greatest keyboard player, drummer, greatest engineer, everything that money can buy, we've put into that room, but we don't know if we're making a hit record or not." Down the street, and he points out a big glass, plate glass window in the lobby. He says, "Down the street in that warehouse is a kid with a TAC 4-track, and he's making a hit record. You know why?" And I said, "No." He said, "Because he wrote a hit song. That's how you make hit records." So,
It's as simple as
it really is. It's a simple formula. It's just not simple to write a hit song.
not easy. It's simple, but it's not easy. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, that's cool. And when you started, did you have a clear direction that you wanted to interview, hit songwriters? I know you guys also get into deconstructing songs. That's, I think, Duncan's end of things. Duncan's the editor. He was supposed to join us today, but unfortunately couldn't. By the way, tell Duncan, I read in his bio on your website that he's a huge Neil Young fan. Tell him if he looks carefully at some Neil Young records, you'll see my name on them. I worked with Neil for hundreds, probably a few thousand hours back in like 76, 77, 78. So,
Amazing.
yeah.
Maybe you can
Anyway.
put in a good word for us.
I'm sorry?
Maybe you can put in a good word for us, Michael.
Yeah. People always say to me, why don't you get Neil Young to be your interviewee, your keynote interview for the Taxi Road Rally? And what scares me about that, I mean, we always worked really well together. We parted company on great terms and everything. But if I ask Neil, what does it take to write a great song? He'll just say, "Well, man, you just got to write what's in you, I mean, if there was ever a songwriter that doesn't pay attention to song form or any of the normal constructs, Neil is that guy. He really does just write what's inside, and what comes out is kind of magical. But he's the exception, not the rule.
Very true.
Anyway, so did you have a clear vision when you started the
Very.
magazine that how you were going to approach it, and kind of like, did you think of it as an educational component to interview hit songwriters, or did you just want to interview them because you wanted to know what they knew?
A bit of both. I mean, because I had been an amateur songwriter, novice songwriter, and then sort of managed to get some of my music out there, and had met with people who had been successful as songwriters. I knew that songwriters songwriters shared a passion, a hunger for learning, and so for me, there were three things that we really wanted to do, and we continue to do now. It's about inspiring songwriters, so uncovering the stories about how great songs were written to make people realize that actually, hey, I could do that. Yeah, you can do that. It is possible. You just need a guitar and a pen and a piece of paper, and you can write a great hit song, as you've just mentioned there, or a piano. You don't even need an instrument to write a great song. Um, but you need some inspiration to spark that creativity. So it was about inspiring. It was about informing and educating. Say the part of the same thing, really. Um, Helping songwriters to learn about the craft, but also the approach, what it takes to be a successful songwriter. And the third thing is about opportunity. So we wanted to be able to highlight opportunities, songwriting competitions, songwriting retreats that people could go to meet collaborators, ways that they might be able to get published, or at least get some experts giving some feedback, and so those were the sort of three facets that we wanted to cover in the magazine. But luckily, I also had the experience of working in magazine publishing for the previous kind of 5 or 10 years, so I knew what it took to create a magazine. So I knew the sort of what we needed in terms of the editorial and the content, and how I didn't necessarily know how to approach that because I'd worked mainly on the commercial side of things, on the business side of things. So I asked Russell Deeks to start me off. Really, he was the editor of Songwriting magazine. He was the editor of the magazine I worked on prior to that, International DJ magazine, and so I knew he had experience in terms of what it took to create a publication. So he was absolutely instrumental in terms of getting us on the right track, and then Duncan took over the editor role. Must be about 4 or 5 years ago now.
And do you find that there are similar traits amongst successful songwriters? Everybody's looking for a shortcut, and who wouldn't? Everybody wants to know, what do I not know that I need to know that can make this happen faster or better for me? Are there any personality traits or work habit traits, anything like that you've noticed that are a thread that runs through many, if not most of them?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I've had the pleasure of interviewing, it must be over 500 songwriters
Wow,
now.
that's a
And
lot.
it is a lot, and it is fascinating now to every time I speak to a different songwriter, I'm not getting the same answers to these questions. We're asking very similar questions, and sometimes it is as stupid as asking what does it take to write a hit song?
Right.
Um, and there are very different personalities that come through, but the commonality tends to be that songwriters are relentless and obsessive about songwriting. Um, they are constantly looking to fill that well of creativity. They're looking at ways uh, to approach songwriting differently. They're wanting to be as prolific as possible, and always try to not just write more songs and write more for the sake of it, but to write better songs each time. Um, and I think I've noticed how the they look at their output as ensuring that they are turning up, working hard, showing up. That strong work ethic. They're very, very disciplined. A lot of them subscribe to the kind of 9 to 5. Like, I'm going to clock in. I'm going to show up at the page.
Wow.
And I have that approach. Diane Warren, for me, was one of the my favorite interviewees. She wasn't very she wasn't able to articulate how she wrote songs. Either she wasn't able to or wasn't willing to give away a secret of how she does it. But the quote that I took was, "Work hard, show up." That's what worked for me. And she said, "I love what I do," and I think that's the key thing. They absolutely fall in love with the process. I think that's a famous quote, isn't it? It's, to fall in love with the process of doing that. I think a lot of successful entrepreneurs fall in love with the process of the hustle, making money, being successful. It's not to do with reaching £1 million. It's to do with the process of getting there, or dollars, or whatever it may be. But it's that they're obsessive and curious, relentlessly curious about the process as well.
I think that you've already answered the question why some songwriters are successful and others aren't. It's that obsessive nature, because creative people have in my humble opinion, having been in the industry now for somewhere around 45 or 50 years. I can't believe that. But yeah, it scares me when I do the math. The people who aren't successful yet get hurt. They get injured. They put their tail between their legs. They go home. A pro songwriter, as you're describing, may get hurt, may get injured, may have their ego crushed, but they will pull the tail out from between their legs the next morning and go right back to work. And I'm a little surprised, frankly, that they've mentioned that they treat it as kind of a 9 to 5. Now, Diane Warren, I've interviewed her as well. She's a handful. A lot of profanity in that interview that had to be bleeped out. But I heard a great story. One of our former employees at Taxi was friends with Diane, and there were a gaggle of ladies that were all friendly. And Diane didn't have much of a social life, so every now and then she would invite the ladies over to her house, I think in the Hollywood Hills, for like a pool party on a Saturday afternoon. And as the story went, the ladies showed up. Diane greeted everybody at the door, made a pitcher of margaritas, brought it out to the pool, gave everybody a towel, and went right back into her studio and worked the rest of the day while all of her friends hung out at the pool.
Mm-hmm. I'm not surprised at all. Yeah, that sums her up. Absolutely. Yeah, I think success doesn't happen by accident for a lot of these people. You've got to be willing to put the hours in and be absolutely devoted to the craft.
Do you find, if you had to get, and I didn't give you this question in advance, if you don't have a good answer, I won't mark it down, we're not keeping score, but is there a median age of the people that you've interviewed? Are they, like in their 30s, 40s, 50s? And I'll tell you why I'm asking that in a moment.
Probably as much by accident than design that it is the same sort of my generation and older, just purely because I've always wanted to be able to interview some of my heroes from the 90s and 80s music that I absolutely loved growing up, and inevitably some of the greatest songwriters were sort of more successful in the sort of 60s and 70s, or sometimes when one of our regular features is called How I Wrote, where we don't want to get into the technical minutiae of how a song was crafted. That we'll leave that up to another magazine. For us, it's more about the story, the journey that a songwriter went on to craft that song, and we actually ended up publishing a book. That I'm trying to get onto the screen here, which is still available on Amazon. You can plug that as well.
Go ahead and
How
tell
I,
them what's the title? How I wrote it.
how I wrote. It is the true tales behind over 40 of your favorite tunes. So there's sort of the likes of how Robbie Krieger of The Doors wrote "Light My Fire," how "All Right Now" by Free was written, etc., etc. So some classic tracks, and obviously we went out American Pie. We wanted to tell those stories. A lot of those had been, fairly well known, but we tend to, when we sort of dig under the surface, we tend to get a little bit more detail than maybe other publications might get on these sort of stories. So there's a few things where we've been on a call with somebody and they go, oh yeah, I just remembered actually. It was called this, or oh yeah, I hadn't told anyone this before, but I've just realised that, blah 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 blah, and it's like, great, we've got an exclusive. We managed to get that out of someone. But to answer your question, it tends to be that we've inevitably, it's speaking to an older generation. But then again, we're conscious of that, and we're very, very conscious of making sure that we're covering as many bases as possible in terms of gender equality, diversity, and I think one question you were going to ask is about genre, and whether we have sort of genres that we tend to fall in. So, age-wise, we're trying our best to encourage. We're trying to interview and feature as many different songwriters from different backgrounds, different ages, and because we've worked hard at that, I think certainly gender and diversity we're pretty good on, and in terms of genre, we still tend to get a lot of singer-songwriter led music put to us, or PR companies from who represent singer-songwriters. So we do tend to get more of the pop, rock, country, Americana, singer-songwriter led stuff. But we'd love to be interviewing more, jazz artists, hip hop, urban, you name it.
The reason I asked you about age is that I've noticed among, and I hate to use the word amateur, but people who are not professional songwriters yet really struggle breaking free from their generation. We all fall in love with music probably, when we're somewhere between 10 and 18 years old. That's kind of the window where music becomes central to your life. Actually more powerful than television, which is cool. But I find that a lot of songwriters that I know and artists that are now 40 or 50 years old and returning to it because life got in the way. They put it on the shelf and now they're coming back to it, but they're very much stuck in that generation of music that they grew up writing. And I was wondering if you've noticed any patterns from the pro songwriters, how they stay relevant, how they stay current, and how they avoid sounding like they used to sound 20 or 30 years ago. Have they ever tipped their hand to you at all about that?
Well, absolutely. Actually, yes. Diane Warren again gave that sort of a chink in her armor. She gave away a little bit of the secret sauce there, and she said, and I'll quote her directly here: "You have to stay current. You have to listen to what's going on. I've always been a sponge, so I always take in influence. It's about keeping it fresh and being current. You can't stay in one time. You always have to keep moving with the times." And I can't sum it up better than that. I think that's key. It's keeping an open mind, wanting to keep your music fresh. And I think to speaking to anyone who maybe absolutely still loves the music of their teens, and whether that's in the 60s, 70s, or whatever, a lot of that those sounds are still coming back round. Hear it in hip hop and urban music is sort of sampling melodies from sort of 70s, easy listening music,
Right.
and things that come back round. So, and the genres, I don't think they've been any more of a cocktail and melting pot now than ever before. I think anything goes. So actually, I think if you are of an era and you know that era very well, use that to your advantage, but don't be afraid to try and bring it up to date.
Yeah, that's the hard part. It seems for people is bringing it up to date. I can't remember if it was on an episode of Taxi TV or whatever the context was, but I heard something recently. It was a Taxi member, I think, having an issue with the critique they got from the screener, saying that the samples in a particular song sounded really dated. And if I remember correctly, it wasn't, and the member said, I just went out and spent $500 on this new sample pack. Couldn't be dated. It's the latest, greatest by whatever manufacturer. It turns out the way they voiced their chords, the melodies they wrote, you put it all together and overall it sounded dated. Therefore, the string sound or the horns or whatever it was in that song sounded dated because of the writer's approach to it. So I think that Diane Warren's advice is really good, that, yeah, you have to listen to everything and don't listen to last year's hits or this week's hits. Try and imagine what next year's hits will sound like. That's, yeah.
That is key, Michael. Yeah, I can't remember what songwriter was telling me, but they were saying that if you're going to try and keep up with what's hot right now, you're already too late, because that was
Right.
being worked on A&R 3, 4, 5 years ago. You need to look at what's going to be successful in 5 years' time, but nobody knows what is going to be successful in 5 years' time. Nobody's got a crystal ball, so you have to kind of write from your heart and write what you know and love, rather than trying to second guess what's going to be successful. I think that's the key thing. And the other way to remedy that, I think, another tip is to collaborate. Don't try and do this all on your own. The vast, I can't remember what it is. I was interviewing someone, and the average number of songwriters on a track is 7 now. I think something like that.
Mind blowing to me.
Yeah. So that just shows that even the best professional, successful songwriters realize that they can't do it all on their own, and if they may be losing touch of what is current and fresh, they'll collaborate. They'll find a co-writer that can help them see what might be more current. So I think that's a key lesson that I've picked up. Go together. Go with a team of people. Build your team around you, and don't be afraid to collaborate. There was Wesley Schultz of the Lumineers, who was a cover star of ours. Ho Hey was the massive tune quite a few years ago, but we kind of did a follow-up interview with him to do a little bit of make it more of a tips piece. So typically with interviews, we'll talk about their approach, but we won't explicitly ask them for some tips. Whereas this time around, we went, just give us your top 5 kind of suggestions for songwriters. And again, a quote that sums it up perfectly. Real collaboration can give you things that you could never do alone. So in a way, the sum was greater than its parts. If the parts can put their ego aside and listen to the thing that hits them hardest, and don't worry about keeping score of who did what. I think that's a worry that I certainly had when I was going into co-writing. You're kind of worrying about, I'm going to have to split this, and worrying about the royalties and worrying about that. In the creative process, that's just not going to happen. You've got to forget about who's writing what and who's responsible for what. Just go into a session with co-writers with an open mind to try and get the best track possible, the best collection of songs possible, and then worry about what's going to happen to them afterwards.
You're right. Everybody can't play, all the bases in a baseball game or all the positions in a baseball game. And we've seen that time and time again. It's something that I never would have thought of when I started Taxi, but just on their own, the members have figured out that collaboration is the key. And now, obviously, the internet makes collaboration so much easier. And so we have some Taxi members that are really good with their DAW and they can build killer tracks, but they can't write a melody. It's just not what they do well. And they team up with another member that they might very well meet in a chat room on one of our episodes of Taxi TV. And they start collaborating, and a year later, they're becoming successful just because they put their ego aside, said, I can't do it all. There's somebody that does something better than I can do it, and I need that to make this work. I don't think we've got very many Taxi members that are collaborating with 7 people, but I've seen it when you go to award shows, like ASCAP or BMI award show, and they call the writers up for big hit. Like they barely have room on stage for everybody. It's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think just to add to what you're saying there, it doesn't necessarily have to be a discipline you can't do yourself. I think I certainly suffered from that in the early days. I thought, well, I can do a bit of production. I know my way around Cubase or Logic. I can play the guitar. I can write lyrics. I can write melody. Yeah, I can do this all on my own. I don't need anybody else. But then you kind of get very insular. You follow the same patterns. You don't push yourself. I think that's key. I think a lot of the great songs at some point were awful songs, and probably for a large part of the creative process, they were terrible songs, or they were okay and they were good, but the songwriter just kept chipping away, pushing it. Right, actually, that chorus isn't big enough. We need to go another level. And I think a lot of songs, big successful pop songs, like I've noticed, he's on our wish list, Max Martin. I think he's been ASCAP Songwriter of the Year last 10, 15 years in a row or whatever. Hopefully we can have a chat with him. But you notice a lot of his songs, they start off amazing, and then they go up and they're even better, and they almost have like 2 or 3 choruses, 2 or 3 amazing hooks just in one song, and you think, I can't get any better, surely that can't get better. And I think that's where that separates great songwriters from amateur songwriters. An amateur songwriter will come along a hook or a chorus and go, that's good, fantastic, there we go,
I got it
done.
Yeah
But a great songwriter will go, it's not good enough, or they'll have another songwriter come in and go, hey, I've got an even better middle 8 or a break or a bridge that will go in there and take it up another level and keep pushing that song to be as great as it possibly can be.
You used the word insular a couple minutes ago, and notwithstanding COVID, because that was a circumstance nobody could have predicted, but it used to be songwriters would get together in a room with a couple of acoustic guitars, a guitar, a piano, kind of brill building style writing. And things have changed so much, but yet the tools have dictated that everybody can stay home in their basement studio and make a record, not just a demo, but a record now. It tends to push creative people to be more insular. And I hope that this conversation we're having causes more people to realize they need to, at least electronically or telephonically, video chat wise, get out of their basement and collaborate with other people, because it's something I never would have guessed, but it's become so apparent being the owner of Taxi that collaboration is like 75% of the successes I see. Collaboration is at the crux of it. So
Absolutely.
Have you noticed, how did COVID affect the people that read your magazine or the people that you interview? Did they talk about that, about the isolation of not being able to go into a room with anybody, and how did they deal with it?
Yeah, I think it affected everyone in different ways. um, but it forced everyone to try and find new ways of doing things. I think that's, restrictions do help the creative process sometimes because it forces you to think differently,
Right.
work differently, and adapt. And I think, as I was saying, one of the traits of songwriters is they are willing to adapt to new scenarios, new situations, but also keep working. So when I spoke to songwriters, they weren't working less, they were writing more because they were forced to spend time at home when they would normally maybe be out on the road. And yeah, for a lot of songwriters I speak to, they say that they can write when they're on tour. They can write in between sound checks and in hotel rooms and things like that. But the vast majority of them say that's not really conducive to a creative environment where you're having to do promo and you're having to do signings and you're just sort of on that sort of roller coaster, and it's just hard work. So I think when the whole kind of touring machine ground to a halt, for a lot of songwriters I was speaking to, it was a sort of welcome respite. It meant that they could actually create and not have the pressure to do so. But then I think we've all adapted to sort of adopt technology like we're doing now. Um, I think people are more willing to collaborate digitally using video conferencing, and the technology. Luckily, I mean, the technology's been there to do this before, but I think it's just the circumstances forced people to embrace that
Yeah.
a little bit more.
Yeah, we saw that as a company at Taxi. I was always afraid of us working remotely, and a 4-day brush fire in Los Angeles forced us out of the office once, and we found out that using WhatsApp and Zoom, we could work very effectively together, and certainly songwriters have figured that out as well. Let's talk about your readers for a minute. Are they more? Are they more interested in getting their songs cut by artists on labels, or are they interested in being artists themselves, or are they interested in writing songs that they license for film and TV? Is there any sort of pattern in your readership?
I think the pattern is that, or the trend is that, songwriters increasingly have to do all of the above, and try and find lots of different ways to supplement their income or find ways to, if they want to, if they want songwriting to be a career, then they can't just rely on uh, creating their own music and just putting that out. It's been well publicized that the minimal sort of amount of money that anyone's making from, or sort of certainly grassroots songwriters are making from streaming services, yeah, that is not going to be fixed anytime soon. So I think songwriters for a long time have had to try and find other ways of promoting their music, but not so necessarily just promoting the music, but promoting their skills, and working their songwriting ability. So whether that be getting their songs placed, TV, film, video games, I think in various different forms, or whatever way possible, writing, collaborating, co-writing with other people. I think that's where, again, going back to the sort of three things that we're trying to do with the magazine, it's about inspiring, informing, but also then giving opportunities to songwriters. And I think that's something we haven't done as much of as we'd like to. And that's one of the key reasons for us speaking with you, Michael, and with Taxi, to enable us to be able to do that, to be able to connect, to allow songwriters to become better at what they do, but better at promoting themselves and better at, for want of a better word, exploiting their skills and their
Well, you and I, being that we both love marketing, we have that. But for most people, especially creative people, selling is a dirty word. And I don't know if they're afraid to sell because you might get rejected. Sales are tough. You got to call 100 to make a single sale. Do you think that songwriters are waking up quickly enough to the fact that they do have to do it all? Are you getting any feedback like that from your readers? Like, wow, man, you're right. I can't just sit in a basement with an acoustic guitar, and Logic and lay down some tracks. It's not going to magically float through the air and land on some A&R guy's desk or end up in a TV show because my next door neighbor is a film director. Do you get a sense that people are starting to come to the realization that they do need to do it all?
I think so, anecdotally, from people we speak to. I did a talk for students at the ICMP, the Institute of Contemporary Music and Performance in London, songwriting students. And to be honest, they were more aware of ways of promoting music than I was, and they were talking about NFTs, and they were talking about all the different sync opportunities, and so they're clearly thinking so that they're finishing school and college, and whereas my generation, that's sort of a bit of a sort of a catch-all sort of term, but from when I sort of left school and college and looking at university in the 90s, there wasn't anything really that you could do as a sort of a career in music, unless it was sort of classical music, or just sound engineering and that sort of the technical side of things.
Right. Oh, I lost him. Oh no. There you are. You're back. All right. Yeah, I should have warned you before the show that if it happens that we lose each other, just click the link and I'll let you back in again. But oftentimes it does it on its own. It's scary when that happens. Gee, I'm glad we're not live.
The system is dropping me a hint to stop talking, stop rambling.
No, this is fascinating stuff. I love it because I spend so much time running Taxi, and my staff and I talk about this stuff. But I was excited to speak with you because, as you said when we first met, you're on the other side of the pond, and I wonder if this is like dogs on the American side, cats on the British side, but it sounds like it's the same. That songwriters are songwriters are songwriters, artists are artists are artists. That very, very similar.
Yeah. So what I was sort of getting to was the fact that I think songwriters now have got a lot more opportunities than sort of 20, 30, 40 years ago. But you have to be looking for those opportunities. I don't think the old-fashioned way of starting a band, writing some songs, performing, getting discovered, sending a demo cassette off, and getting signed, and becoming a successful songwriter that way is it was never easy. That was always a bit of a lottery, a bit of the dream. Now there are a lot more tangible, structured, academic, and methodical ways of being a professional songwriter, I think
a lot of people fall back on the old chestnut that it's like, I want it all, I do it all. If you walk up to many songwriters and say, well, hey man, what kind of music do you do? Oh, I do a little rock, I do a little pop, I do a little country. And I think that a lot of people are compelled to say that because they think that it displays their versatility, therefore makes them more appealing. When actually, to a real pro in the industry, it's like, oh, you're not a professional yet because nobody does all of that well. And when you ask a lot of songwriters or artists or even producers. It's like, well, what's your goal? What is your end game? And the phrase, I just want to get it out there. I want to get my music out there. And that is, I mean, it's not embarrassing that they say that, but it's very fuzzy and ill-defined. It's not specific. There's not a target in front of them, which I believe makes it harder to be successful. If you don't see what you're aiming for, it's going to be really hard to hit the target. Do you get that same sense from people that it's like they know they want it, they feel somewhat maybe even entitled to it because they love it so much and they've got that passion that you spoke of before, but yet they can't put it into words. I want to be a songwriter for this type of artist on major labels, or I want to write songs that would work really well in TV commercials, which is a different type of writing. Do you get that same sensibility from people that you speak with anecdotally?
Yeah, I think what you're touching on there, Michael, is the fact that what we talked about earlier was the difference between Taxi and Songwriting magazine. With Taxi, you're speaking directly. 99% of the time, you're speaking directly to aspiring songwriters.
Right.
Grassroots songwriters who are wanting to get up there. They want to be successful. They want to be professional songwriters. Whereas on a day-to-day basis, for us editorially, we're speaking to as successful songwriters as we possibly can. Obviously, we're wanting to speak to the superstars, but we're equally wanting to speak to a lot of those that are behind-the-scenes songwriters who are successful. Now you see them in the credits, or you see them, at the Grammys, but they're not necessarily the performers. That for me is really, really interesting. But as I say, when we speak to professional songwriters, they're very driven. They aim for the pin to hit the green kind of thing. They know exactly what they want. They're focused, and they'll worry about diversifying further down the line. They're not worried about being pigeonholed too early when they're in the early part of their career, because they know that if they're successful on one avenue, that will open up opportunities for them to experiment and do other things. Gary Barlow is a perfect example. Take that songwriter, very, very successful, has been very successful. He has nothing left to prove, yet he is still writing. He wrote a song for a Saturday night TV quiz show here in the UK, and he treated that the same way as when he was pitching songs 15, 20 years ago. He didn't, very sort of vague brief, but he knew that it had to be as perfect as possible. It wasn't a kind of, as he talked about, it wasn't a pencil drawing. It was the whole kind of artwork completely created. But he knew he was pitching it still. He's been writing music for West End musicals and writing music for other different areas. He's not precious about what he's writing for, and I think that's, again, he can afford to try these different things and to write in different areas now, but each time he's very, very disciplined, and he is still trying to work hard and deliver.
I like the fact that you use the word precious. That's a word that I've heard during my entire career in the music industry. And I don't think that the people who are precious realize they're being so precious is part of the problem. I would define that as, this is what I do, this is what I've done, it's great, isn't you've got to love it. And they're not open-minded about expanding their style or moving to another similar genre, pushing the envelope a bit, or collaborating. Do you see a lack of preciousness in the pro songwriters that you interview?
Yeah, and keeping open mind, I think, in the creative process is really important. So another thing that comes up quite frequently is using different instruments, not just waiting to get writer's block and get stuck on one instrument. But there was a songwriter called Jamie Lawson, and this crops up again. I could probably find 20 or 30 other songwriters who've said the same thing. Different instruments are very useful, especially if like me, you can't play them very well. Seriously, there's something about naive playing that will open a lot of space in the music. So he was specifically picking up an instrument he couldn't play because he wanted to try and write a different song, or try and open up something that he hadn't been able to explore. And I think when you're too kind of set in a particular genre, using a guitar and a specific type of acoustic guitar in a specific type of way, your hands tend to go to the same chords, the same movements, you come up with similar melodies. And if you're going to be prolific, the problem is you're going to end up with 100 songs that sound very similar. And if one of those isn't successful, the other 99 aren't going to be successful either. So you need to be able to keep pushing those boundaries, experiment, try different things. And I think that's the kind of antithesis of preciousness, which I think is key. Always be willing to just try things.
Well said. Yeah, I've had people tell me the exact same thing, but rather than a different instrument, they'll try different voicings on chords, or a tuning that they've never used on their guitar. Go to a drop D or something, and all of a sudden it's like they got a whole new life as a songwriter. So I think that's great advice. Any other tips come to mind that you've heard? Some gems that have fallen from the lips of the pro writers that you've interviewed?
Yes. So I suppose I've mentioned a couple already in terms of sort of the work ethic and collaboration. Something about being prolific. Gary Barlow also said it's got to be fun. There's no use this being a chore. Work hard, but it really don't let it feel like work. If it's feeling like it, you're sort of pushing a rock up a hill, just stop, just forget it, because you won't get something that has the energy and the excitement and that playfulness. And I think there's another common thread, is that childlike playfulness that I think a lot of songwriters still have. So regardless of whether they're 18 or 80 years old, they've got that sort of childlike naivety about music, and I'm always kind of willing to sort of pull the song apart and find out what makes it tick. And so I think that enables, if it's constantly fun and you love what you're doing, then it will never feel like work. So that's sort of the kind of flip side of that coin. Be ready, I think, was another thing that sort of cropped up a few times, and not just be ready for an opportunity. So being ready for ideas to come at you, because you might turn up at 9 o'clock in the morning with a guitar and be right, I am going to write a brilliant song today, and you can force it. Sometimes just turning up and getting there, but other times, it's like sometimes the best idea comes at the most inappropriate moment.
Always the shower. Yep.
Yeah,
always the shower.
Absolutely. Washing the dishes, driving the car. It crops up so many times. There's been a few massive songs that have been written not while driving the car, I hasten to add, but one of the most recent interviews I did, which was an absolute dream, was interviewing the 2 or 3 songwriters that wrote the songs to the Dirty Dancing soundtrack. So I've Had the Time of My Life, Angel, Hungry Eyes, and they were fantastic. They were an absolute pleasure. We haven't published that yet. That's going to be coming up in
Well, you're going to be really glad that you met me, because a really close friend of mine is a gentleman named Michael Lloyd, who produced the Dirty Dancing soundtrack. I'd be more than happy to introduce you to him. He's a great interview.
Yeah, well, so Frank, we interviewed. I did the interview a month or so ago, but we haven't published it yet. And it was Frank.
I'm saying as a follow-up.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be fantastic. Yeah, to get the other side of the story.
Yeah.
on the production side of it. Yeah, always good. We're interested in speaking to producers as well as songwriters. That's always great. But he was talking about how they wrote "I've Had the Time of My Life," and they knew it had to be a big song. It was going to be the epic song at the end of the movie. It was going to be really, really important. The song. Talk about pressure to come up with
Yeah.
something. But it was I can't remember the co-writer on that track. It's given him the cassette, and he just was driving somewhere in California, I think it was, just driving along the highway, and just stuck the cassette on. I'll just have a listen to it, and it was just some melodies, I think, and a backing track, and that was about it. And it immediately was just like, I've had the time of my life. He pretty much sung that out loud
Wow.
over the. Luckily, he was able to pull over, and just on the exit of the freeway or wherever it was, and grab a piece of paper from his glove compartment and wrote down "I've had the time of my life" and have that melody, and just quickly went back to his sort of home studio, and the rest is history. But that he talked about how that song became pivotal for the movie. It wasn't just a great song that happened to be on the soundtrack. It was pivotal. They used the demo that they recorded in the filming of that scene. And up until that point, I think Patrick Swayze and Jennifer Grey was it,
Yeah.
and the cast weren't really feeling the movie. They weren't really getting into it. And then they filmed that scene with a song, and suddenly there was excitement. It was like, wow, that's a great song. Who did this? And it was just like, so the knock-on effect. If Frank hadn't been able to capture that idea might have gone. It might have been called something else, and maybe it might not have been as successful. So yeah, be ready to capture ideas at any time. Another more recent example of that is Dan Wilson. Used to be Semisonic, and now written Adele's biggest hits, and prolific behind the scenes songwriter now, as well as in his own right, brilliant singer-songwriter. He's got, if you find him on Instagram, he does sort of Instagram stories, and he's got these sort of deck of cards, sort of postcards. And he uses those to just jot down a little lyric idea, or it might be a chord sequence, or it might be just a strange kind of juxtaposition of thoughts. He'll just jot it down, stick it in the pile, and then when he has Dell over, or whoever it might be coming over to do it, they'll just kind of, there we go, there's a card, let's riff on that. What does that mean to you? And so he's using them in two different ways. He's not just capturing ideas and then just leaving them to kind of get forgotten about on a hard drive or on your iPhone or whatever it might be. He's then keeping that pool of little ideas, little nuggets of creative sort of spark to use when he's lacking that creativity. So that was a key thing, as I say. Be prepared, be ready to capture ideas at any point.
I've heard the same thing said about reading books, novels in particular, obviously not like business management books, but I think the first person to ever mention it to me was Eric Clapton in a conversation we were having, and I asked him, how do you get inspired? And he said, I read every night. And he said sometimes a storyline, sometimes just 3 words in a sentence will inspire a song. So I thought that was cool. And I've mentioned it to other people during the course of my career, and so many people, it's like, oh yeah, like you didn't know that before, we all do it. You mentioned producers a moment ago, and let's talk about production as it relates to songwriting. Have you heard from any of the people that you've interviewed that they've had to cross over to the dark side and learn how to run Logic or Cubase before they were purely a songwriter with an acoustic guitar or a piano? Maybe they were even just a lyricist. But all of a sudden now they realize they've had to up their game and more fully flesh out the quality of their demos, and that the rhythm tracks, the tracks are so, I won't say more important than they used to. They are. Songs rely more heavily on rhythm as it relates to the delivery of lyric, the sounds of the instruments used in unusual rhythmic ways that were never done before. Do you hear from the pro songwriters that you've interviewed that, oh yeah, I've had to transition and learn how to run Pro Tools in my home studio, or is that not a discussion that happens?
Yeah, certainly. Gary Barlow talked about that. Again, I think he's such a fan and a bit of a geek when it comes to music. So his background, was playing keyboards and singing at kind of at clubs and venues when he was like 14 years old. So he obsessed about keyboards, and then it was synths, and then it was microphones, and then it was about, okay, wow, and then it was sort of hardware and outboard and mixing desks, like what you've got behind you. He was a real kind of student and wanted to learn and absorb and see what was going on and see how how a song comes together. And I think latterly now, obviously, being able to have a state-of-the-art studio in their house, a lot of these very successful songwriters, so they have the benefit of doing that. That said, luckily the technology allows pretty much anyone with a fairly average laptop or desktop computer, even with an iPad, you can do so much. You can get load up GarageBand, and you can do a lot of things that previously, I remember when I was, in the 90s, when I had a 4-track recorder. It was an absolute nightmare. It was great fun, but a really kind of rubbish Casio keyboard and a acoustic guitar and this Tascam 4-track, and just trying to get anything recorded and was such a challenge. And now the challenge is you've got all the technology, all the different myriad options available to you. I think the challenge now for a songwriter who's wanting to dabble in production or wanting to learn more is trying not to get completely sucked into all the different plugins and different.
Right. Don't spend 3 hours looking for the perfect kick drum song. Just write the damn song. Right?
There's
Exactly.
another good tip actually from Gary Barlow again, and he's one of the most recent kind of interviews. Actually, it's a few years ago now, but for me, I was overjoyed to be able to interview him. But he said he has to guard against that, so he has a timer. He has like an egg timer thing.
Wow.
Those cooking timers, and he sets it to 20 minutes. And he'll go, right, I'm going to record a guitar now, or I'm going to work on this guitar sound, or I'm going to work on this reverb for 20 minutes. So he has to force himself, because he said otherwise he'll be there for hours trying to perfect this, get the compression absolutely perfectly right. And even he suffered from that kind of like, was it shiny dollar syndrome? What's that?
Oh, absolutely. It's a very deep hole that's very easy to fall into and keep going. Have any of the people, or maybe many of the people that you've interviewed, talked about how they deal with writer's block?
Yes. It crops up less than I imagined it to.
Interesting.
I certainly suffered from it. Some people, I remember Lamont Dozier, obviously the Motown legend. He said we couldn't have writer's block. So back in the sort of the very gaudy days of obviously having to write hit after hit for Smokey Robinson, the Jackson 5 or whatever it might be, and they were just having to churn out the hits. That they were under pressure because they knew that if they didn't succeed as a songwriting team, there would be plenty of other people who wanted their job. So they were like, we couldn't afford to have songwriter's block, and so when I ask that question, it's probably 50-50. It's probably 50% probably go, no such thing, you just keep it going. Or, Dan Wilson, as I say, I think they have mechanisms for avoiding writer's block. So they want to make sure that it doesn't happen. do they have tools in place that allow them? So, like that deck of cards that they can turn to. So, if rather than having a blank piece of paper,
Yeah.
Karen Poole, who was part of a band called Alicia's Attic, and now is a sort of behind-the-scenes songwriter for Kylie Minogue and a lot of British pop acts. One of the first sessions she went into, even though she had some success as a songwriter, as a performer, she was invited into one of her first writing sessions. Was with Danny Minogue, Kylie Minogue's sister, who had a short-lived pop career. But Karen was invited in, and she was so nervous because she kind of pitched herself and promoted herself and said how brilliant she was as a songwriter. She'd had her manager saying, "You want to get Karen in? She can write with Danny." And she knew she was going to be in this kind of quite intimidating scenario where you're sat there with the artist and then maybe a producer or a co-writer, 3 or 4 of you in a room, the A&R guy or gal, there, and having to come up with the idea, having to come up with a song or help the artist come up with a song. And she went in there armed with a pile of books, and these were all her lyric books where she just scribbled down ideas. So she was glad that she wasn't afraid to go in there armed with kind of her safety net, her kind of comfort blanket of those lyrics there to turn on. So she was able to just open up a book and kind of go, "Oh, how about this for an idea?" So again, it's preemptively avoiding writer's block rather than actually trying to do something about it when it happens.
I think that's incredibly solid advice. Looking to see if there's anything we haven't covered, and want to let the people in the chat room know that in a couple of minutes I'm going to open it up for questions from you folks. So start thinking of your questions now, and when you do post one in the chat room, type the word question in all caps so it's easy for me to spot. Considering that the magazine is international in scope, based in the UK, do you see any differences when you interview songwriters from the UK versus American songwriters, or could be songwriters from anywhere? Just does geography dictate anything as far as the process or maybe genres, anything at all, or is it universal in a global way?
A few things that come to mind is that I think the UK, we haven't got the kind of long list of different charts for different genres. So I think it's encouraged songwriters to think holistically about songs and not think about, I'm writing what will be a hit on the country chart or the hip hop chart or whatever it might be. So I think there's been for quite a long time a sort of a melting pot, and I think a lot of songwriters realize they can't just focus on one area, that they have to be open-minded in the UK, but still having a little bit of that kind of focus on the UK market. And not really thinking outside the UK. I mean, we're very, very lucky with, having some of the great British music being being great exports for us for the last 6-7 decades.
Absolutely.
So we're blessed with that, but maybe we take it for granted a little bit that the rest of the world will listen to our music and think it's brilliant. I think that's one thing that maybe we're guilty of here in the UK, but having someone like Ed Sheeran, who's being a fantastic ambassador for British songwriting, again showing how a pop song can be so many different things, and it can incorporate folk and urban styles, country, and it can cross over. I think that's key. I think whereas when we're speaking to American songwriters, I think they're more conscious of the fact, when we're speaking to Nashville songwriters, I think
Yeah.
the way of songwriting in Nashville is still a heavily disciplined approach and needs to be approached in a particular way. I think there's a few British songwriters who have kind of marveled and revered Nashville and gone over there and then come back and go, wow, that's next level songwriting. Wow.
It really, it's hard to explain to somebody who hasn't been immersed in it. And 15 years ago, I was going there 6 or 7 times a year and had several friends that were huge hit songwriters, several friends that were A&R people, several friends that were publishers. I would go to Nashville with a song that I heard through Taxi that all of us agreed, this has got to be a hit. And you play it for people over there and they go, it's pretty good, but, and they would literally take it apart syllable by syllable and say, well, right here you're saying but you really should be saying and, because the thought process is they work so hard on their craft and are so brilliant that it is at a level that can only be understood if you've been somewhat immersed. Otherwise, people think it's all about pickup trucks and 6 packs of beer in the swimming hole in the summertime. Much, much more. Let's take some questions. There are quite a few stacking up. People are enjoying the interview and have stuff they want to ask you. Mike Wetzel wants to know, what's the fastest shortcut to getting a song idea out? Are there any actual steps or ways that you can recommend?
When you say out, do you mean out of kind of your head and created, or do you mean out as in
I think he means out of your head. Okay, song idea out. Yeah, because a song out is one thing. A song idea out, means coughing it up.
2 or 3 aspects to that. So there's the getting it out of your head and getting it down and getting it externalized. Mobile phone voice notes keeps cropping up again and again as an indispensable tool. There's a few people who stick to sort of pen and paper and want to have a moleskin notebook next to their bed, whenever they've got an idea. Or, but yeah, it crops up so many times. Again, it was Wesley from the Lumineers who was talking about the fact that the quality of the recording was actually good enough for a finished take. They actually used what he put down on a voice note, recorded. I don't know what phone he was using, but good advert for that.
Yeah.
He was just, I can't remember what it was, but it was just, and he captured it, thinking it was just going to be a kind of, stream of consciousness, get an idea down, that's fine. And they ended up using that actual recording, vocal recording. So get these ideas down. Another thing to talk about stream of consciousness, that was another a common technique for if you've got a melody but you haven't got a lyric, just to kind of mumble words, use whatever to just get that melody down and worry about the lyric later. Sometimes, lyrics come out at the same time. Like I've had a time in my life, that example, that was where the melody and that line came out. But so many of these songs started out as just kind of just little hooks, little nuggets of ideas, and then they needed to be sort of crafted.
Did you watch the Beatles documentary Get Out?
I have watched almost all of it. There's a lot.
I watched it twice in a weekend, and
wow.
and pulled my chair up 3 feet from the TV and just got completely sucked into it. I was amazed by, first of all, I think I'd forgotten how many covers the Beatles played when they were playing like the Cavern Club or wherever. It's amazing. They would start noodling, covering somebody else's song, And instantly, even though it was just two of them screwing around on an acoustic and a bass, it started to sound like a record because they were just so good as players. I had another thought about that and I lost. Oh, just exactly what you said, which was very often when it showed them working up a song, they would do exactly that. They would just make up silly lyrics or just make noises, and later became brilliant songs. So clearly that technique works. All right, let's take another question here. Have you ever interviewed Ryan Tedder?
No, certainly been on the wish list for a long while. Yeah, he's such an incredible songwriter. I think there's a lot of songwriters who have been successful writing music for their band, so I love One Republic stuff anyway, and clearly has a knack for writing for himself, but then being able to translate that and just step across seamlessly to be able to effortlessly write for other artists. I think that's fantastic. So yeah, Ryan Tedder's certainly on that list. Hopefully we can interview him soon.
Looking for another one that makes sense. Well, some of them, people are typing them in shorthand, and it's kind of hard to figure out. Here's one from Larry White. I'm a songwriter and singer, but I'm not a producer or beat maker. I've been networking, but most people already have an instrumental done. Can I make it in this industry without having the beat?
Larry, yes, absolutely. I think it would be helpful if you could collaborate and find someone, but if you can't, then carry on. I mean, there's been a lot of there are plenty of tools out there that allow you to create a beat very, very easily, that you could use as just a kind of working guide. I think just straight out the box with something like Logic, I think you've got templates that you can load up, and just kind of plug something in and just kind of get something that can be really good for sort of guarding against writer's block, to have something as just a bit of a backing track which you can take out later. It means that you've got something, that you've got a click track that you're working to, you're writing and playing and performing and recording to that rhythm. I found it harder then to get a producer to kind of drop in a beat that match that, because it's tied to the groove that you've kind of worked on. But absolutely, and a lot of songwriters subscribe to the belief that if it works on an acoustic guitar and a voice, that's it. It just needs, anything else is just embellishment. And it should be able to stand on its own 2 feet with just that.
Searching for another one here. Bear with me, please. Here's one from 3860 Bush. That's an unusual name. It's all a process, but which do you feel has more realistic opportunities, music licensing or placements with artists?
Good question. I think, Michael, you're probably best placed to answer that, knowing your involvement and opportunities. I think there are, my belief is that there's organizations that can have both, and place the music with, depends whether they mean finding the artist yourself as a songwriter to write with and write for, versus working with a publisher who can place those songs with other artists or licensing.
I think you can do both, and I sometimes jazz people get very upset with me when I say this, and I'm not really clear why, but I've said that learning how to do instrumental tracks for film and TV, like for reality TV, just goofy little pieces of instrumental music, and I say that affectionately, because we have members that are making multi-six-figure incomes by doing that. That's kind of like painting houses by day to put food on the table. And that doesn't prevent you from sitting down at night to work on your grand opus, which is writing a hit song for a major artist. And by working on film and television, instrumental stuff in particular, it helps you get much faster using your workstation. It helps you make your own little catalog of sounds. Like you have your go-to bass sound, your go-to kick drum sound, your go-to mic that you use on acoustic guitar, whatever. So by working on the film and TV stuff as your day job, you're prepping yourself to be a better songwriter and producer to write the big hit that you've always dreamed of having. That's my take.
Yeah, and just additionally on that, Michael, is if you're prolific enough and you're continually creating ideas, not all of those are going to turn into brilliant songs that you can get placed with other artists or record yourself. There might be kind of a 30-second kind of idea that you haven't really been able to take it any further, or 2-minute instrumental track, like you say, and that might be placed because you've just kind of it served its purpose. Then it frees you up to, like you say, work on something else.
I've only got 4 minutes left, but you just mentioned something about not finishing something and only having 30 seconds. And I actually had written a question about this. So many songwriters that I know have countless incomplete songs sitting on their hard drives. Have any of the pro writers indicated to you any methodologies they may have for, just plowing through and getting it done and forcing themselves to finish it, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse? Or do they leave an incomplete thing on the hard drive thinking, someday I'll go back and finish it?
I think the key learning for here is it goes back to the collaboration side of things. If you're working purely on your own, in your own little microcosm, and you're just building up this catalog of ideas, you haven't got anyone as a soundboard to say which one of those ideas has got legs, and so you tend to just keep going and keep going and keep going. Whereas if you're working with an artist or a band, co-writer, anyone, just your partner, your kids or whatever, just play them an idea and see if they get excited about it. If it's a potential collaborator, then they might go, oh, I've got an idea, I might be able to work on that, and then suddenly that little idea takes flight and it can be allowed to flourish. I think that, as I say, that avoids the kind of build up of lots of little ideas. You've got to allow yourself to be vulnerable, because a lot of those ideas may be rubbish, but you've got to kind of go, look, all of this is rubbish, but there might be something in this. If it stays on your hard drive, then it ain't going anywhere.
Absolutely. And how can you be a hit songwriter if it ain't going anywhere? I've got to say, this has been an incredibly informative and enjoyable interview, Aaron. You are so not only fortunate to have interviewed all the hit songwriters that you've interviewed, but you've absorbed it well. You're not just repeating it. It's obvious to me that you've absorbed it and your brain has wrapped itself around. So you should go back to songwriting at some point, is what I'm trying to say, because you've learned so much, which you said at the onset that part of it was for you, because you want to know the answers, and clearly you're sharing them with everybody else who's in a similar position. So thank you for sharing all that you've learned. Also, please, before I say goodbye and forget to do this, give everybody both of the domains for your website so that they can go check out Songwriting Magazine.
So songwritingmagazine.co.uk, songwritingmagazine.com. Spelled all one word, as it sounds. We also produce a quarterly digital magazine at the moment. We are looking to go into print with that magazine later this year. So feel free to. There's tons of content on the website. It'd be great if you could subscribe to our quarterly digital magazine. But you can also, on the website, you can sign up for our sort of email subscription base to be kept in touch when we do have the print magazine if you're interested. You can sort of sign up for sort of to be the first to hear about it.
Well, I look forward to seeing it, and I spent a big chunk of this past weekend on your website reading the interviews and stuff, just getting to know you vis-a-vis the interviews. And I want to let everybody know that if you've not been there yet, go there, because the quality of the content is excellent. It's at a magazine level standard versus a lot of the social media stuff, which is not. It's really, really, really good. For those of you who've read Paul Zolo's classic book, Songwriters on Songwriting, this is like the living, breathing, ongoing version of that on steroids. So congratulations for doing such a great job on that. I'm really, really proud of you, Aaron.
Thank you, Michael. That is high praise indeed, because if I get the chance to meet Paul Zolo, he was the person who inspired me, because that was exactly what I wanted to do. I read that book cover to cover and just thought, wow, I want more of this. I want to be able to read this every month, every quarter. And so that's what inspired me to create Songwriting Magazine. So that's
if I remember correctly, back in the day, he was one of our earlier screeners at Taxi. He was a member of the A&R team. I think I'm remembering that correctly. And I'm sure I've got his number in my address book or my Rolodex. Probably I did have it in an actual Rolodex back then. But the next time you come to Los Angeles, please let me know in advance, and I'll hook you up for a lunch with him or something, because I remember he's a very nice guy, very understated, very humble, very nice.
Right.
Well, with that, I thank you very much for joining us. Aaron Slater, ladies and gentlemen, and I will see all of you guys next week for another exciting episode of Taxi TV Live. Bye-bye.